I have a question. So, what would you say is the true meaning of working on yourself then? And, we were just talking about duality. How does that duality apply while working on yourself? And just to give a little background, I think often there's so many times where you see people go through a breakup or people go through financial hardship or just life experiences happen, and it really transforms them and causes them to work on themselves. But, to that end, what would you say is the true meaning of working on yourself?
Yeah. I think it's, in one sense, it's as simple as this. It's paying attention to what goes on within you emotionally and mentally. That's it. At its most basic level, is just paying attention. And not just assuming that, on the one hand, that's either totally self-directed, that it's not in reaction to anything at all. You're just this totally independent entity that's completely self-determined. So that on the one hand, and on the other hand, I'm just this completely manipulated, controlled kind of victim of circumstances. Mm-hmm. Right? But to recognize that there's a middle ground in there, that we do have individuality and self-determination, and we do have reactivity to circumstances that is sometimes beyond our awareness and control. But what helps us keep that middle position is what we were talking about earlier, and that is the realization that, oh, wait a second, if I really pay attention to my consciousness, I can recognize moments when something enters into it that isn't just a result of one of those two things.
So, with the ego, as Alex floats away over there, because his ego is so big, right? Just kidding. But how would the ego play into that, while working on yourself? Is that something you would recommend you have to essentially take out of the equation altogether? And how would somebody do that?
As long as you're in dualistic consciousness, the ego's there. It may be really, really thin and flimsy and lightweight at some times, and other times be the exact opposite. But to some degree, the ego's always going to be there if you're in duality, because it is that perception of otherness, right? I am something separate, something other, something different from whatever else. And then, of course, a lot of the things that we build up on top of that we typically mean when we're saying ego, like, selfishness and narcissism, those kinds of things, those are built up to help protect and maintain that sense of otherness and disconnectedness. Somehow we've gotten the idea that it's dangerous for that sense of otherness to become thin and lightweight and flimsy, and to recognize our interconnectedness with everything. That's been part of our programming, is to believe that that's dangerous. And there's probably also some natural drive for that as well. It's a combination of nature and nurture. Mm-hmm. But so the idea of once and for all annihilating the ego and then continuing to exist without an ego while you're in duality, as far as I'm concerned, that's just another illusion. Can a person be free from narcissism and selfishness? Yeah, I think that there have been some human beings who have demonstrated that their ego is so refined and so transparent that there's just no hint of narcissism or selfishness in those human beings. And those are really special human beings to me.
Thank you, Chuck. It's nice to be recognized.
Yeah,
absolutely. Now, if would you say, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but I sort of do, because I think it's a wonderful thing if we could speak on that level of, like, after can I say that you experienced an awakening? Would that be fair to say? Throughout your process of on that Kensho level, in other words?
It's fair to say that I've had a number of experiences that I would call non-dual experiences.
Okay. Do you still exhibit a monkey mind in that sense, where thoughts are okay? So that has
not in the moment of those experiences, but coming out of them. Yeah, I still do.
Got it. I'm just trying to sense, because I mean, obviously, the way that at least DeLulo talks about it, and I guess Adyashanti, at some point, what happens is, the way that it's described is, after the Kensho, when it sticks, quote unquote, what happens is you lose the perspective or the depth or of time and space between yourself and the immediate moment, right? So then you have that non-dualistic thing. Assuming that's persistent, then the monkey mind stops, but what starts instead is basically almost an immediate idea of shadow work, because it's almost like you have no skin then. You're literally in the present moment to moment, and all of that stuff comes out because there's nothing really holding it back anymore. Your id, in essence, kind of just assaults you, and you have to just, on whatever level, start to deal with the shadow, because there's just nothing holding it back anymore. Have you experienced any of that kind of thing, and how do you deal with it?
Yeah, I would say that I've had, my experience has some resonance with what you've described. So when I answered the question, yes, do I still experience monkey mind? I do, but not in the same way that I used to. What I find is that there are moments in life when my awareness of the non-duality of things, when my awareness of dualism as a veil on non-duality kind of slips away, I kind of forget it for a little bit. In the same way that a person who's a lucid dreamer might slip in and out of lucidity in a dream. It's like 1 second, oh, I'm dreaming. And they get so involved in things that they forget that they're dreaming. And then they go, oh, that's right, I'm dreaming. So if you're a lucid dreamer, you know what this experience is like. This a very similar thing has happened to me in the aftermath of the unitive experiences or the non-dual experiences that I've had. They don't happen as often. They don't last as long, but they still happen. And when I'm in one of those moments of non-lucidity, then my mind can start functioning again in the way that minds typically do when they don't have non-dual realization. Like flitting around and being anxious and jumping from this to that and trying to overanalyze things and
Got it.
And not relating to things from a position of love, but more from a position of ego, and more about self-love than loving all, and self in the sense of the small s, which is a limited dualistic thing, trying to preserve that. But now what happens is just the rise of that kind of mental activity wakes me up. It's like, oh, okay, that's happening again. That means I kind of slipped into the dream of dualism there for a moment. and how can I kind of wake back up a little better, and so a lot of the practices that I have developed over the years are just about this moment to moment kind of awareness, self-awareness, and less about things like, performing rituals and doing really elaborate kinds of sitting meditations and imagery work and all those kinds of things, which I still do, but not as much, and they're not as important to this ongoing development in stabilized awakening or enlightenment or whatever we want to call it.
So,
go ahead.
Sorry, Alex, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
No, I was just going to
ask.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask, in terms of, you're talking about your inner self, inner consciousness and such, would you describe that as really inner light then? And if it is inner light, how would you differentiate that from an illusion or, your reality?
Yeah, what do we mean by light? Inner light. My second teacher used to talk about the word light really as the light of awareness. That for him, light was awareness. Consciousness can be aware and unaware. We talk about unaware consciousness. We use the term unconsciousness as if consciousness is something that can go away. But in this way of speaking, consciousness itself never goes away. Consciousness is always present. And it just has different modes. And one of its modes is unawareness, like dreamless sleep, for example. Consciousness still exists, but in dreamless sleep, it's just unaware. Unaware of sensory perceptions, unaware of any mental processes, those sorts of things. Brain activity, all that stuff. It's just unaware.
Mm.
So, well, there's an example. I just slipped into unawareness because I was so busy trying to explain what I mean by this that I forgot where I was going.
So inner light, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yes, that's right. So thank you for bringing me back to that. Yeah. So the inner light is awareness, right? It's like a beacon of awareness. Where are you turning your attention? Where are you turning your awareness? That's light from this teacher's perspective.
Mm.
And so when we say Masonically that we're seeking more light, what we're actually saying is not that we're trying to receive something like light shined on us. What we're really trying to say is we're trying to become more aware.
Mm.
And then in your greater awareness, you begin to realize, okay, well, yeah, there's also awareness being directed from all these other directions and perspectives. Other human beings, for example, they're all shining their light. And sometimes our lights intersect with each other and our awarenesses overlap on something. And that gives us a better perspective on what that is, a better understanding when we share our light with each other.
I like that. Do you feel on some level the whole idea of psychology or psychiatry as it stands is basically just trying to help us to be better dualistic creatures rather than really getting us to a better understanding of that light or of really getting into enlightenment?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, as a practitioner in the field, well, retired now, but as someone with decades of work in mental health and in higher education, I would say that, yeah, that largely mental health and education are about making us identify with and function more effectively in some ways in the two-dimensional dream of the one thing and the one non-dimensional thing. And but there are exceptions. There are schools of therapy that advocate moving into these higher states. For example, transpersonal therapy is one example. Psychosynthesis is another. You could argue that Jungian psychology is another. And there are educational systems and programs that that at least have a philosophical background that acknowledges the potential for transcendence. Yeah. So one example for that would be like the Waldorf School, associated with Rudolf Steiner. It's kind of based on a lot of the teachings of Rudolf Steiner. There's a philosophical background.
Like Landmark then and Est and stuff like that?
Yeah, I think you could argue that, yeah.
Interesting. Go ahead, Dave.
So how would you say individual inner work would impact the collective consciousness? And, especially with some of these groups and, even Freemasonry, how does that individual impact, the entire consciousness collective there?
Ripples in a pond. Each one of us is generating ripples in the great pond of creation. And, at different frequencies, different amplitudes. And the question is, what kind of ripples do we want to generate? Those ripples go out and they interact with other elements within this great sea of existence, and they create a kind of symphony of vibrations. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we, in our heart of hearts, how do we want to contribute to that symphony? What's the sound we want to produce? What do we want others to hear from us in that symphony? And that means really like searching our hearts and listening for what I was thinking of earlier, Alex, when you were talking about, is it in your heart? Is it in your third eye? Where is it? I was thinking about the story of the prophet Elijah and the still small voice. It wasn't the rumbling of the earth or the lightning flashes and stuff like that were the voice of God, but it was the still small voice. And so it's all of this work that we've been talking about doing, of trying to get into that place of openness and receptivity to realize the touch of the divine in our lives, is about, in this language that we're now using, hearing that still small voice and then sharing it like a prophet would do, singing it, putting it out there, sending those vibrations out into the world. And we can do that through, all kinds of different means. Some of us do it through writing and speaking. Others of us do it through acts of kindness and generosity. Paul in the New Testament talks about spiritual gifts, and every one of those things that he lists as spiritual gifts can be a way of radiating love in purer forms out into this great sea of existence.
Do you, so you espouse this contemplative sort of way, but contemplation is not meditation. it is also not necessarily prayer, right? So how would you define contemplation, just for the folks that don't really have that sense of what that is?
It's an important question, Alex. I'm glad you've asked it, because it's another one of those words that, depending on who you're talking to, it's going to mean something. It can very well mean something significantly different. I speak of contemplation in the way that it's typically spoken of in the academic world right now, and that is, it's used as an umbrella term to denote ways of intentionally focusing and using consciousness. It's intentional awareness. And so there's all kinds of things that are contemplative practices. Ritual is a contemplative practice. Meditation is a contemplative practice. Mindfulness is a contemplative practice. Dialogue is a contemplative practice. All of these things are contemplative practices. Now, one of the questions then becomes, what are the motives and the intentions that are driving those practices? And that's significant, because it shapes what the potential outcomes of the practices can be.
That's interesting.
Yeah, we probably should have asked that question right from the start.
we got around to it.
Yeah.
So, and I'll ask this because, in my mind, I'm writing a book. I mentioned to you a little bit ago that I was doing that, about how men can become better men through the use of sacred spaces. Obviously what we're doing right now is a sacred space, right? So I would say, if Dave doesn't drop his stuff all over it,
try not to.
Just put it down anywhere. It's fine. But the whole idea, Dave's burning incense. I do that too, and I'm sure we all do to some extent, to create a certain atmosphere that can be done. And I guess it's with the idea of sacred space is a workshop, right? So it's a way to use it as a doing to create change within ourselves, however we're going to do that. How does contemplative practice create that sacred space?
Mm-hmm. Well, at an individual level, what I do, I have practices that I do here just on my own in my home. I have a little dormer window nook up here on the second floor of the house that is curtained off, and that's where my oratory is. That's where I do my prayers and meditations, and my personal rituals are in there. And just looking at the curtain, I'm looking at it right now, just looking at that curtain automatically starts to shift my consciousness, because I've got this habitual kind of reinforcement that says, okay, consciousness is changing. I'm moving in there to change consciousness, and consciousness is already changing as I move into there. So that also happens at a group level. It's like, even with a Masonic lodge where the guys are not thinking about any of this contemplative, some Masonic lodges, many Masonic lodges, nobody's talking about contemplative stuff, even though it's mentioned in the ritual.
Right.
Nobody's talking about meditation. They're not talking about sacred spaces. And yet their mind is already changing as they approach the lodge building, and as they cross that threshold into the lodge room, there's already a set of expectations about what are you going to be doing with your mind, how are you going to be acting with your body, what kinds of emotions are and are not appropriate in this setting. Those all changing consciousness. And, we defined contemplation or contemplative practices as intentional changes in consciousness, intentional changes in awareness. And so that's just kind of built into into the way our minds work and in the way we interact with others. Now, if you start really getting intentional about that, and paying attention to the technology of contemplative practices and being intentional about how you use them and understanding what their effects ideally can be, then that just magnifies. It's like you've plugged in the amp, for the guitar at that point.
Can you talk a little bit about more what that actually means? What is the technology of contemplative practice in this sense?
So, for example, if people know that, okay, when I'm in ritual, when I'm doing ritual, it helps for me to have an understanding of what these different symbols and these different instruments in the ritual represent in a spiritual sense and what they represent in a psychological sense. If I'm aware of that, and I'm also aware of what kind of effects that this ritual is supposed to be generating on the people that are participating in it, on, if it's an initiation, on the individual that's receiving it, then those effects, if we think about it carefully, if we can contemplate it, we recognize that there are going to be emotional energies that are associated with what we're trying to project and with what the effect is on the person that's receiving it or the other people in the ritual. And so that's actually like tuning in a frequency. Emotions are energies. They are emotive. They make things happen. And so the emotional energy that we're putting into the ritual has an effect on all the other people there. And so if we understand what that emotional energy ideally should be, and we can, through practice, learn how to call up that energy, feel it, and project it through our voice and through our bodies and actions, connected with the intellectual understanding, the philosophical, spiritual understanding of all of these things that we're interacting with, then you can see this is like just turning up the volume on what's going on in the ritual, what the ritual is designed to do. It's not just a set of motions that we have to go through. That's the volume's cranked down to almost zero if we're just going through the motions and mouthing the words. But when we plug in these other aspects of our thoughts and our emotions, we crank up the volume.
Would you then argue that, and not to put you on the spot here, and I'm not disparaging or saying anything negative, Alex is wincing over there, would you say, especially in Masonry then, at the moment, too many guys are going through the motions and not turning up the volume? Because I've read, I love your blog and reading about the Chamber of Reflection. We have one in our lodge, which I feel like is just an amazing experience for everybody.
It's a must-have. Absolutely.
Yeah. But do you feel like we'd be better off returning to more of the observance lodges and that type of realm?
I think Masonry would fulfill the purposes it was designed for more effectively if we did so. I would not say that that's the only thing about Freemasonry that's important, and that every individual needs to be as deeply committed and involved in that as like I am, right? I'm deeply grateful for the fact that there have been Masons for generations now who have found something in the ritual worth preserving, even if they didn't find it worth contemplating at a deeper level. They didn't realize that they were actually performing contemplation when they were learning and performing the ritual and learning and regurgitating the catechisms, but they were, and it had a positive effect on them in some way. Everybody benefits in some way from those experiences. But again, it's about turning up the volume. I mean, or you could say it's like turning up the brightness on the TV screen. I mean, do most of us really want to watch a broadcast, a video of some kind with the brightness turned down so low that we have to squint at it to see anything, to make out anything that's meaningful, that touches us in any way? No. We want that brightness turned up so that we can actually see what's happening, and have the volume turned up so we can actually hear what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
That's the difference that I'm advocating needs to happen in Freemasonry, and not just Freemasonry. There are other orders, some of them that are well-known esoteric orders, where that's not happening. People have kind of fallen into the practice of like going through the motions and mouthing the words, and they've got the volume down near zero.
Yeah, and I would even argue that probably happens in church too. You see everybody just going through mass and they regurgitate the prayers or whatever they're supposed to say and do, but yet it's like ultimately when they leave, did they really reflect on what they were just saying or what they were doing? Yeah. Probably not.
Going through martial arts is a good example, I guess, of this. I've in Tai Chi, I've seen it happen a fair amount. People get into it, they become incredible practitioners. They've turned up the volume, right, as we're talking about. They've amped it up to a great extent. They move the chi. They do everything they need to do. They've got their jings and their everything else. But they started the whole thing from an ego position of how great I'm going to be when I do this, of how great my thing is. So they're trapped within that realm. And the reason, at least in the system that I've seen, there is Li, which is the actual physical version of using something, right? So the pushing, the using of the body to do something. There's Qi, there's mind power, so to speak. There's spiritual power, which is on top of that, the third level. And then there's void. Which they call it, which is sort of amorphous understanding, but there's basically like things like literally skipping through time to get behind somebody, or doing things that require almost supernatural type of abilities. And there's guys that I know that have been able to do everything except that, because they're fantastic at everything that takes control. Everything that is regimented, everything that is allowed and concerns power and force and the doing of something. In void, there is no doing of anything. It almost does unto you and allows you have to let go into it, right? So, and I guess I'm getting back to my own limitations here. That letting go is a tough one. It's a really tough one because, and I spoke with a friend this morning who Dave knows, who is just like, how do you let go? How do you do these things of like being able to get into these things? And again, it's, one of my main guys that I learned from is Dr. David Hawkins, who spoke about devotional non-duality. But again, he wrote an entire book on letting go and what that means. So, it's a fascinating and maddening thing. To do these simple things, which I guess if you don't do these, you can't do the better stuff. And I'm just drowning at the seashore instead of getting into the deep water. What would you, if you were to come up with a system, which I know you probably have already a system, that you would recommend to the viewers or anything? Would you have anything in particular that you'd want to point towards that would be helpful for stuff like that? Because I'm sure there's other people that would benefit from that.
Alex, are you speaking specifically of a system to help people get to that void kind of experience that you're talking about?
Yes, certainly, but also as a preliminary of just like being able to seek out somebody who can assist in that relaxation, that we were talking about.
That can be really hard to do. It can be hard to find someone that feels trustworthy, that's qualified in some realistic way because they've actually done the work themselves, or that they've that they have also gone through kind of mentoring and coaching in their work. It can be really hard to find individuals like that. And this is one of the benefits of finding one of the esoteric traditions or systems or schools that's been around for a while, that has some kind of a positive reputation for producing what you might call adepts, and then go ahead and kind of signing on and putting yourself in that student position. If you're not interested in an organizational approach, then it can be even harder to find an individual to work with who can say, yeah, I can take you through that process without you having to, become all involved in this society or this fraternity or whatever. I suppose one of the ways of doing that is to look for the people out there who have websites or blogs, look for people who've written books, who write articles, who do podcasts, and just really, really carefully exercising your faculty of discernment to try to see who out there is it that seems to be the kind of person that your heart and soul naturally resonates with, and try to make contact, reach out. And there are a lot more of those kind of people that are willing to make themselves available than I think a lot than folks realize.
Really? Okay. That's great to hear.
Yeah. They may have some limitations and say, hey, I'm definitely glad to be a consultant and a coach, but it's not something that I can do like on an everyday basis or once a week or whatever. And so you may have to work within their time limitations.
Sure.
But there are a lot of folks out there that are willing to help out and have, I would say, a legitimate background for providing that kind of assistance.
Got it.
Yeah. But they can be hard to find, even though there are more out there than we know. I will say that, but they can be hard to find.
I guess you don't have to go to Nepal necessarily or someplace like that to.
Well, just call Arendelle and talk to Elsa, and you can let it go, Alex.
I guess I don't know what all that means. Okay,
it's a Frozen reference.
Okay. I'll ask my niece when I see her later on today.
There you go.
She's big into Frozen. Do you? You mentioned before that, and we don't typically get into Freemasonry for a bunch of reasons, because obviously, we're all Masons, but there's things that obviously we can't talk about publicly to folks outside the fraternity. But you did mention that there is, at least in your mind, what the original understanding of Freemasonry was sort of there to do. And I think we could probably talk about that with some clarity, sure, without infringing upon any of the stuff we can talk about. So what in your mind was that idea, that mission of Freemasonry, at least originally?
Yeah. I think Freemasonry was meant to be initiatic, mm-hmm, and transformative, and to lead individuals and groups of individuals to a realization, to a deeper awareness of their oneness with the divine and each other. That's what I think it was meant to do. When I say initiatic, I mean change the direction of my life. Mm-hmm. When I say transformative, I mean actually become a different kind of presence in this world. Right? So change to become a different kind of presence in this world. And then all of that facilitating me becoming more in harmony, more in tune with the divine, recognizing my connection with the divine, and therefore with each other human beings, and therefore being a more effective presence of the divine within the world.
Wow. That'd be really good. Have you seen it do that in any meaningful way currently? I mean, in certain areas where it has succeeded in doing that exact thing?
Yeah, I can think of some lodges that I would say are probably more effective along those lines than the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And I can think of plenty of individual Freemasons who that has been the effect of their experience, their participation in Freemasonry.
That's great. That's very heartening to hear. I mean, I think, as we say, on the individual level, I think there's a fair amount of New Jersey Masons that do a really good job of that. That's our main pool of being able to chat about. I will not comment on what level the organization in New Jersey is doing either good or bad. I don't think it's my place to discuss that. Certainly not among non-Masons, but even though I think obviously there are plenty of efforts and programs and things that I think are extraordinarily worthy in the smaller microcosms to which I've been a part of that I could speak to and I could say good job. And say that. I think the larger organization is trying its best to meet certain challenges of the modern day. We'll see how that goes over the long term. It'll be an interesting thing to see. Dave, you have any more burning questions you want to put to our guest?
So circling back,
okay,
those entities you were speaking about within, kind of the gatekeepers, the dimensions, whatever, when you're going up the ladder, could they be misconstrued possibly as aliens or some other type of entities like demonic or, jinns, whatever folklore is out there as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And I think, different cultures have different ways of relating to these beings because we can't, at least ordinarily, see them with our physical senses and interact with them through our normal means of interacting. And even if we could, and sometimes it appears that it does happen, I think they present themselves to us in ways that are culturally relevant. They learn how to speak our language, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Exactly, what their nature is and who they are, I think is mysterious. But I think traditions provide us meaningful ways of interacting with them. For example, my background has given me a lot of interaction with what I call the Archangel Raphael, just as an example. Well, do I think that Raphael really looks the way that I imagine Raphael, that I visualize Raphael? Do I think that Raphael really has the name Raphael at some, level of personal identification? Yeah, that's my real name. I can't answer those questions. What I can say is that this mysterious entity and I can relate to each other through that name and through that imagery, that those are effective means of connection between us and communication between us. And so this is another reason why I think traditions are so important, is because they provide time-tested means of interacting with these other entities. Just one example of things that are time-tested through tradition and why traditions are valuable.
Sure. Thank you for that. And here's another question that I've written out. So, how do symbolic languages impact consciousness? And is there a way to speak in symbols internally? And when I say, the symbolic languages like alchemy, certain things of folklore, like you're alluding to, I guess mathematics in some degree, and others, astrology.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that, because I was about to ask, is there a non-symbolic language? I think one of the things that happens is, every language, if we just think of like literal languages, English, German, Spanish, Japanese, every language has its strengths and weaknesses. Every language is better at doing some things and not as good at doing other things. And you can find a different language that is better at doing those things that the other language is not so good at. Every language carries with it certain expectations and rules about how they work. And those rules are effective in facilitating communication between people that use that language, right? So the same thing is true for these different languages that we find within the mystery traditions, like the language of alchemy and how it has been used for now psychospiritual development, and has apparently always had a spiritual element to it. But certainly in the 1800s, maybe you could even, and I would even argue from the 1600s on, that language has been a very powerful form of communication, not only between individuals trying to conceptualize and talk about their journeys of initiation and transformation, but also as a way of conceptualizing how initiation and transformation can work. The language of Freemasonry, the operative Masons' tools and building materials and techniques. There's another language that can be very effective once we get enough people speaking it and understanding, what's really being communicated through that language. So I think all of these languages have value, and each of them has their own kind of area of expertise and special talent and ability. They interconnect with each other just like real human languages do. And to some degree, we can say that they're all manifestations of just the primal instinctive drive toward language. Just like we have a primal instinctive drive toward transformation. And so it's just different circumstances in which those drives arise and begin to manifest determines the kind of languages that get developed for how they're expressed and facilitated, for how that those processes of initiation and transformation are expressed and facilitated.
So let me ask you this. Obviously, there's certain limitations to all these languages, and we even have other languages like Enochian, for instance, the language of the angels, quote unquote, ostensibly, as it's said. But I'm surprised that at least I haven't seen it. I've heard it mentioned once as possibly the language of the birds or something like that it was called. It was sort of like the pre-Diluvian language, pre-Babel, where it was like before the Tower of Babel, when we all unified in that. But no one really, I haven't seen any hope or any sense of restoring that language or that, the possibilities of sort of moving in that direction on some level of another unified possibility of that, other than Esperanto, I think, or maybe something like that, which has its own limitations, I'm sure. But do you have any ideas about that at all? That sort of pre-Diluvian language, or anything that was around at that time?
Yeah. I suspect that language has kind of arisen organically in different places and different times. It has emerged organically. If we're just talking about spoken language, for example, that has emerged organically in different places and at different times. And of course, those times and places now being so far back in pre-recorded history that, we're hard pressed to say when and where and what they were.
Sure.
I know that linguists have done a lot of work to try to trace back to, what maybe the earliest known or deducible language could be. So like Proto-Aryan, for example, Proto-Indo-Aryan language. This is not something that I have any expertise in. So, what I would say from an esoteric perspective is that for me parallels the idea that was real popular in the Renaissance of the Prisca Theologia. The original the original metaphysical truth about existence that was communicated directly from God to human beings.
It's like what Krishna said to Arjuna, I guess. Whatever that might be.
Yeah, or Yod-Heh Vav-Heh to Adam,
right?
For example, and so I think what the idea for me really gets at is what I was trying to describe earlier, and that is that we are innately endowed with an instinct, a drive to experience and express these dimensions of reality. We are innately driven, instinctively driven to develop and use language. That's one of the hallmark characteristics of human beings, for example. I wouldn't say it's just us, but certainly, we've got it in spades. And similarly, there is this innate, instinctive drive to seek initiation, transformation, and some would call this the path of return, to rediscover our source, our connection with the source of everything and the oneness of all things. That's something deep, 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 deep down we know, although it's heavily programmed out of most of us, I think, these days. We've been taught to ignore it. We've been taught to poo-poo it. We've been taught that it's, a fantasy and a delusion, and yet we're driven to it. And some of us really consciously so. And so is there an intersection? That's an interesting question between our drive for language and our drive for initiation, transformation, and the realization of oneness? Well, here's one thing we know. Without language, it'd be a lot harder for us to help each other go through the processes of initiation, transformation, and realization of oneness.
What about when it's almost like a language without language, like energetic transmissions, like for instance, right? Whether we're talking about theurgy, if I'm getting the word right, or theurgy, you're accessing the divine or trying to master the below, quote unquote. So how does that sort of work in that sense? Because a lot of it is, and there's obviously different esoteric places where transmission is like the main part of the ritual, so to speak, right? Like even in Tai Chi, that exists where there's energetic transference outside of just learning the moves.
Yeah. Yeah, language beyond language. Well, for me, that would start to move into what we were talking about earlier with Plato and gnosis. And it's the direct intuition, which is so you know that experience when you know that you know something, but you can't put it into words just yet. It's there. It's there. And this is what people do. It's there. It's there. I just can't say it. For me, that's what comes to mind when you say the language that isn't language, or the language without language, the language without words.
Right.
It's, there's a communication happening. It's just going to take a while to unfold it and decipher it, right? And find the proper forms for it.
Mm-hmm.
So the language without language enters into awareness, and then we have to find the elements of the languages at hand that seem to fit it best and reveal what it has to reveal.
And that could be music, that could be art, that could be a million other things other than just necessarily the spoken word in that sense, or the written.
Absolutely. Yeah. It could be anything.
That's fascinating. That's absolutely fascinating. Dave, any final questions for our friend? Because we want to be obviously respectful of his time, and I'm sure he's been very, very kind to give us the 2 hours today to chat with. And anything left you want to chat about?
Why do you feel there's a suppression and a mindset of teaching individuals not to focus on the divine and the esoteric?
Well, let me see if I can put it as bluntly and succinctly as possible. That the people and institutions that wield worldly power are essentially sociopathic. They don't give a shit about human beings. They see us as commodities to be utilized. They're not aware of the oneness. They're not aware of anything beyond, consciously aware of anything beyond dualistic existence. And they're fully bought into the illusion of building up and protecting their egos at the expense of everything and everybody else. And they want to keep us away from the realization of oneness and unity because it threatens our submissiveness to their power.
Wow.
And our susceptibility, not just our submissiveness, but our susceptibility to their power. If we go contemplative and we begin to become more familiar with how illusion works, and then we're more capable of saying, oh, no, you're just the man behind the curtain over there spinning illusions and trying to keep us scared and afraid and divided against each other because you profit from it in your sense of being scared and afraid and divided from others.
That's beautifully put. Beautifully put. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for being honest. Thank you for being you, being authentic and awesome, and a friend and a brother. And with that,
thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. We're going to stop the recording, but I just want to hang around for a little bit afterwards if you have a moment. Until next time, this is Brothers of the Arcana. I am Alex Aldea.
I am Dave Frigno. God bless. Caritas.
Absolutely. And this has been Chuck Dunning. Thank you again.
Thank you.